Kia ora tātou. Kei te tautoko ngā mihi kua mihia. Ki te arawa waka nei tēnei tētahi mokapono o Ngati kahungunu me Ngati prau e mihi atu nei. Tēnā hui koutou ngā kai whakahaere o tēnei hui o tātou. Ka nui te mihi ki a koutou e awhi nei e tautoko nei tēnei kaupapa. Huri noa ngā whaia, ngā rauranga tira, tēnā koutou katoa. It's really nice to be here with you today, and I'm grateful to Ngati Pikiao for the work they have done in organising this hui. I must admit though that I feel a little nervous because I'd imagine that a lot of those of you here are people who've done a lot of research around the tragic issue of suicide, who work at a day-to-day level on the kaupapa. And I know that there are also whānau here who have lost loved ones. And all I have to offer is an overview of as part of a whānau which, like so many others, has been touched by suicide. And what I'd like to do is talk about two interrelated issues and perhaps try and extend the debate. When I started university, what seems a long time ago now, enrolled in law school, and one of the compulsory non-law subjects we had to study was English. And I handed in my first assignment, and it came back with one of those dreaded messages you get from a teacher or a lecturer. It said, "Please come and see me, Mr. Jackson." So I went to see the lecturer and he said, "What's your title?" And I thought he must have confused me with someone else and perhaps thought I was Lord Jackson or something. But what he was merely asking was, when you're going to start an assignment, it's helpful to have a title, and on that title you can hang the threads of your kōrero. That was about the only thing I learned to value from studying English at university, I must admit. The two plays we had to study, one was Shakespeare's King Lear, about a mad English monarch who stumbled round the moors in the dark cursing his whānau. And the other one was Christopher Marlowe's play Edward II, about a mad English monarch who met a gruesome end when he was found to be having an affair with his page boy. About all I learned from those two plays was that not much has changed in the English royal family. But what I'd like to do is take a title from three different stories, and they may seem to have nothing to do directly with the topic of suicide, the tragedy of suicide. But I hope that from each of those stories I can draw threads of understanding that we can then hang on the title. And so the title that I'd like to use is Links, Tragedy and Hope. Links, Tragedy and Hope. The first story concerns some work that I was really privileged to be involved in for a number of years at the United Nations, along with a number of others of our people, helping draft the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that was at times a really frustrating exercise, because if we think it's difficult at home here dealing with one crown, at the United Nations you're dealing with 180, and so that complicates matters. But every year in the drafting of that declaration, there were literally hundreds of Indigenous peoples from around the world who came with the same determination to have an international statement of the basic human rights of Indigenous peoples, to share stories and experiences. And in 1992, at quite an early stage of the drafting, the many delegations from North and South America came to the Indigenous Caucus, which I'd been asked to co-chair, to see if it would be all right if we started that year's session with a minute's silence, because it was 500 years, of course, since Christopher Columbus had stumbled into the Americas and began the colonisation of which we have been a part. So we took that issue to the chair of the working group, and she said, "Oh, I'll have to talk to governments." And she went away and came back about 2 hours later and said, "Oh no, the governments don't want a minute's silence. But if you want to have a ceremony and say a prayer, you can go outside under the trees." So I reported back to the caucus and got the response that I thought I'd get, because they said, "Oh, we should just go in and do it anyway." And so the next morning, about 1,000 Indigenous peoples assembled, waited for the states to enter the assembly, which is sort of a shape like this. And we had decided that once the states were seated, we would walk in around the outside of the assembly and have our minute silence. And if states wished to honour that or to leave or whatever, that was up to them. The Maori delegation was fortunate in each of those years that we had a number of respected kaumātua and kui with us. And that year, the two kui we had were Irihāpiti Murchi from Ngai Tahu and Ngana Kumanhinik from Ngati Tiata. And a group of North American delegations came over and asked us if either Ngānako or Irihāpiti would take us into the assembly room, because they have a tradition of clan mothers, and they thought it was appropriate that our kui should take the delegates in. Ngānako declined and said that Irihāpiti should take us in. And for those who know Irihāpiti, she was and remains a hero to me. She was one of that generation who spoke beautiful English as well as beautiful reo. And in her younger days, she had been an actress. And the United Nations on this particular day, I guess, seemed like a world stage. And so as we walked in, she grabbed my hand, and the delegations moved around the edge of the assembly, and she took me up the centre aisle. And she gave the most dramatic, detailed, lengthy, poetic karanga I have ever heard. She called to the mountains and the trees and the lake and the buildings and the tables and the chairs. And then when we got to the centre point of the assembly, I realised that she actually hadn't called to the chair of the working group. And so when we paused, she said in a stage whisper, in that sort of grand English voice that she had, "Did I forget to call to the chair?" And I said, "Yes, you did." And so she just started again and did the karanga to the chair. And then when she had finished, we began what I thought would be the minute's silence. But instead, at the front corner on one side, the first delegation was the people from the Aztec nation in what is now Mexico. And instead of beginning a minute's silence, their kaumātua stepped forward and began to do an ancient and rather long Aztec karakia. And while he was doing that, I noticed that the delegation next to him, which was the Mapuche people from Chile, and I noticed them whispering among themselves, probably saying, well, those Aztecs are doing a karakia. We better do a karakia. So they did. And then each delegation, as we went around, did karakia. When it came to the quite large Maori delegation, Archie Tairoa led a long karakia from up the Whanganui River. And we just moved around the assembly. Instead of having a minute's silence, we had a 3-hour karakia. And we all realised that little action was not going to dramatically shift states, was not going to make the negotiation of the declaration any easier. But what it did was once again make a statement about who we were as Indigenous peoples, that we have a proud tradition and history that differs from Indigenous nation to Indigenous nation, but nevertheless shares many similarities, as many of you will know. And as we left the assembly that day, one of the elders from the Cree Nation in northern Canada came to thank us for Iri Hapeti doing the karanga and our people playing such a role on that day. And he said something which I've never forgotten and which is the first thread I'd like to hang something on. Because what he said was what today showed me yet again was in our own traditions lie our strength. In our own traditions lie our strength. The second story is much more recent and concerns the daughter of good friends of mine who I watched grow from a beautiful young girl to a beautiful young woman. She then got involved with a young man. The relationship became violent, extremely violent. And the whānau really struggled to know how to help their girl, to save her from what were often life-threatening situations. And often it looked like they were succeeding, and then the relationship would be on again, and the damage and the dreadful violence would occur again. And one day, my friend asked if I'd go around to visit them, or to visit the daughter. And I went to the little flat they had and sat with her at the kitchen table. She had obviously been beaten the night before, and just tried to talk with her about taking the babies and we should go. And then I heard these heavy footsteps, boots on the bare boards of the hallway, and it was her partner walking towards the little kitchen. And as he got closer, she looked at me with a look of fear and dread that I'd never seen in anyone's eyes before. And she said, "Don't even breathe. Don't even breathe." And then the young man came to the door, looked at me, looked at her, swore, and then walked away. But what I noticed too was the look in his eyes, because there was fear in his eyes as well, but it was a different fear. It was the fear of anguish and the fear of loss. We finally got her and her 2 babies to leave, and she is now a much happier young woman. The relationship has now been ended for many years, and the young man, alas, still has that look of fear of loss in his eyes. And I often think about the look in those 2 young people's eyes, and I always am reminded of something that the great African-American writer Maya Angelou once wrote when she witnessed a young black man having just shot another young black man. And she said, "What tortures of the soul have brought us to this terrible, sad, and lonely place?" And that's the second thread I'd like to hang my brief kōrero on. What has brought so many of our people to this dreadful, sad and lonely place that suicide seems the only option. And the third story, inevitably perhaps for those who know me, is about one of my mukapuna. I took her to Te Papa for the first time last year, the museum in Wellington, and she loved it. She ran around the whole time. She tried to climb in the tank where they keep the giant squid. She was pulling things out of drawers, looking at them under the microscope. And by the time we left, I was exhausted. But she took my hand and she looked up at me and said, "This is an imagination place, e koro." And that's the third thread I'd like to hang my kōrero on. That perhaps if we are to look at suicide, not just in the here and now, not just in the development of effective programs, effective ways of helping our people in despair and distress, but try to look at the issue from an imagination place, it might give us a different and perhaps helpful point of view. So if I can bring those 3 stories together under those headings that I mentioned, I'd like to do so now. One of the things that I learned working with Indigenous peoples overseas, as I mentioned, is the links that we share together. We speak different languages, we have many quite different traditions, but we all believe that the earth is our mother, the sky is our father. All of the Indigenous nations that I've had any involvement with have an understanding of whakapapa. They call it different things, of course, but they all talk about the importance of relationships, not just among people, but among peoples and the world, and indeed the universe. And the other thing we share in common, of course, has been the history of dispossession. And when we look at the consequences of that history of dispossession, then as you all know, they are sadly similar too. And I'd like just to focus on one that I'm most familiar with, the way that it is being dealt with currently, and what that perhaps illustrates that is relevant to the issue of suicide. There are, of course, equally common tragedies of suicide among all Indigenous peoples. But the issue that I want to focus on is the criminalisation of Indigenous peoples. Whether it's our people here in Aotearoa, Aboriginal peoples in Australia, First Nations in Canada, Native Americans in the United States, Mapuche in Chile, wherever, they are all imprisoned in disproportionate numbers. And disproportionate numbers or rates is usually the phrase that is used. I have some difficulty with that term disproportionate because it actually posits or positions Pākehā people as the norm, and so therefore we are imprisoned disproportionately to them. And by establishing Pākehā as the norm, it maintains what I call a colonising dialect, which deflects attention from the issue. And the issue to me is quite simple. Either Indigenous peoples around the world are born criminal. Either there is something in our whakapapa that makes us more likely to commit wrongs, or there is something else that we share throughout history. And what we share, of course, is that history of dispossession. And one of the ways in which that common dispossession is now played out in imprisonment rates is illustrated perhaps by the rise in just 4 colonising countries, New Zealand, Australia, Canada and the United States, of private prisons. Private prisons necessarily function as a business. They have to make a profit to be viable, and the only way they can profit, the only raw material they have, is to increase the number of prisoners. And so in research which we have just recently completed, since private prisons were established in Australia, Canada and the United States, and more recently in New Zealand, there has been a 28% increase in the number of Indigenous peoples imprisoned. The rate of imprisonment has increased with the rate of private prisons. Some of you will know that the rate of our young men in prison has hovered about 51-52% of the total prison population since the 1980s, when I was first asked to do some research on this issue. What is alarming is that in the 30 years since then, the rate of Maori women in prison, which was less than 3% in 1988, is now nearly 80%. And I will be interested and saddened, I think, to see what that comparative rate of increase will be when the first private women's prison is established here. And I just wanted to raise that issue because I think in looking at suicide is a sadly human event, but the fact that so many Indigenous peoples are taking their own lives, to me, must share that same causative base in the nature and fact of our dispossession. Not exacerbated by the institutionalisation of criminalising Indigenous peoples, but in what I call the institutionalising of hopelessness that if you dispossess a people, if you take away their land, their lives, their language and their power, then you take away the base of hope. You encourage the people to lose faith in themselves. And it seems to me of the many dreadful things that colonisation does, taking away from people the faith they once had in themselves, is one of the greatest tragedies. And so when I look at an individual whānau suffering the grief of suicide, that grief which is so difficult to ease because it is often so difficult to explain. And when I look at the amazing work that our people are doing, that I know many of you are doing, to help address the issue, I hope that in the development of specific programs, of particular research, you will also have the time and the space and the will to look at that wider focus of what has happened since 1840 to help so many of our people feel hopeless, to reach a point where there seems no hope. And that leads me to the second thread of my kōrero. How have we got to this sad and dreadful place? And I think it's natural that when we are confronted with a suicide, with the figures of suicide, we want to often look at the immediate reasons why. Whānau that I've been involved with who have lost loved ones often, of course, grapple with that very question of why. And perhaps part of the answer is to look back in that history. What has brought not just that person to this place, but what has brought our people to this place. To marvel at the resilience of so many of our people, of the successes we have had and the progress we make. But know that even within all of that success, all of those things that are consequent upon dispossession, the poverty, the inequality, the powerlessness, the hopelessness, are not sufficiently eased that our people reclaim total faith in who we are. So where to? And this is where, as so often, my mokopuna are helpful. Because as in many things, I think it's always helpful to remember that our tipuna often went to an imagination place. When they stood on the shores of Hawaii and looked out across the greatest ocean in the world and said, I wonder what lies beyond that horizon. They imagined they could find out. And so while people in Europe were still paddling in little canoes around their local rivers, our old people set sail across the greatest ocean in the world, imagining that somewhere over there was another place. And when we told stories upon reaching this new land about what it was like, those were stories which gave life to this imagined place. And what I like most when I'm privileged to go to other iwi is to learn the stories that they tell about their place, the stories that they have placed in their land. And so we have a tradition of moving beyond what is the accepted reality. Because I'm sure when someone stood on the shores of Hawaii and said, yep, I'm going to go there, I'm sure somebody standing next to him would have shrugged and said, nah, that's unrealistic. Can't do that, bro. Won't happen. But they did. They broke the bounds of what was the accepted reality, and they went. And too often, I think, because of the situation we have been placed in, we are hemmed in by what we are told the reality is. So we can develop a kaupapa Māori program, but it is tied within the reality of contracts and funding, Crown rules, and so on. And if we seek to do something different, then we are greeted with what I call the shoulder shrug. I often talk about our people's unique eyebrows. Just sneak a glance at your neighbour's eyebrows. We have the most unique eyebrows in the world because whether they're thick, plucked, painted, or whatever, we're the only people in the world who use our eyebrows as what I call telecommunicative devices. Because without saying a word, we can greet each other just by going. Well, Pākehā bureaucrats and politicians have what I call the shoulder shrug. We'd really like to go beyond this reality and deal with suicide or offending or development or whatever within a different framework, within a different imagined place. And you get the shoulder shrug. That's not really the reality. Or worst of all, yes, well, that's a really great idea. And I understand where you're coming from, and I understand your kaupapa. But the reality is, it's not going to fly. And too often, because of the pressures we are under to find solutions now, to ease the pain of a whānau or an individual now, we accept that prescription of what the reality is. And perhaps in suicide, more than anything else, it's incumbent upon us to know that what is the accepted reality is actually what may be causing the tragedies that too many of our whānau face. That if we do not imagine a different reality where whakapapa is treasured not just as a set of human relationships but a definition of place and meaning, if we do not imagine a reality envisaged in the United Nations Declaration that I referred to earlier, for example, that all peoples have the right to self-determination, and by virtue of that right they may freely determine their own political, social, economic and cultural development. It does not say you have that right to self-determination subject to someone else's reality. Just like our people never saw the exercise of mana or rangatiratanga as subject to someone else's reality. So Te Arawa have never seen the exercise of their mana as subject to the reality of Ngati Kahungunu. Ngati Kahungunu have never seen the exercise of our mana as dependent upon the reality of somebody else. But since 1840, we've been taught not to imagine that again, but to believe the only reality is the one where we get permission from Wellington. But if that reality, it's history that brought so many of our people to this dreadful place, if it's that reality which at base is where all the causes and anxieties and mamai that lead to suicide come from, then perhaps like our tipuna we need to be brave and say, yes, we can find answers by going to an imagined place. And often that imagination place may be taking us back to where we have come from. And we are different people now than we were 100 years ago, of course, different even than we were 10 years ago. But the kaupapa, the values, the tikanga, the whakapapa, it seems to me, that can provide that nurturing care within which the hopelessness, the sadness that so often leads to suicide is less likely to happen. So I thank you all for the work you do. To the whānau who have suffered loss, may I just quote a poem by a young whanaunga, and when I was a teenager, my best friend. His name was Taunua Kohere. He was a brother of Arahia Jury, Mason Jury's wife. And he came down to Hastings to go to Hastings Boys High School and stayed with us. In Hastings Boys High School, there were two things which made you God. One was if you made the first 15 and were good at rugby, and the second was if you were in what was called in those days the academic stream. So you had to be really bright or play rugby. If you could do both, then you were super god. Taunua was really bright, but wasn't that fussed about being bright. Wasn't at all fussed about rugby. He'd much rather write poetry. And had he lived, because he was sadly killed in an accident our first year at university, I think he would have rivaled Hone Tūwhare as one of the greatest of our poets. And what I was always amazed is he could hear something or witness something, and he would go away and he would come back and he'd give me a scribbled note on a piece of paper, which was actually a poem. And sometimes he would bring me a poem and ask me to deliver it to the girl that he thought was particularly cool at that moment. And I had to admit with some shame at his tangi that I'd often use some of those poems for my own purposes. But one day while we were at high school, a student, Maori, another whanaunga, committed what was then regarded as a really, really awful thing. He took his own life. And we went to his tangi. And when we got back, Taunua disappeared into his room and came back later and gave me this little poem. And I kept those little scraps of paper, and when he died I took them to the tangi, and his whānau said I could keep them and they remain one of my treasures. And he called it simply suicide. And it's a short poem, and it went, "At the tangi today, it was so hard to cry. Perhaps it was hard to cry because it hurt so much. And perhaps it hurt so much because I looked for hope and couldn't find it in the grieving faces. And although I couldn't find it in the grieving faces, I looked to the whare, and the hope was there, in the tupuna, proud, reaching out, saying, cry, hope, never despair." I hope that is comfort to whānau. I hope it is some help in your work. Kia ora tātou.